All right, we have a very interesting talk today about challenges in conserving Australia's forests and oceans. Speakers are Rosa, Ife, Hannah. And before we start the talk, I would like to acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants to continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society.
Let's wait until they. So hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Rosa, and me, Hannah, and Faye in order will present a little bit about projects that we've done about the PBC Act. We're all PhD students and we've all done different things for our PhDs. So I'll start talking about the ocean and threatened marine species. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so it's this was one of my chapters on the paper that we published last year, where we look at threatened marine species specifically, those that are valuable for commercial fisheries. So within the PBC Act, there is a list of threatened species that includes terrestrial, marine. Yeah, those are good too. And has categories that we could expect to find in other threatened species like lists, like the IUCN Red List. So extinct in the wild, critically endangered, and vulnerable. But the EPBC Act has a unique category that is called conservation dependent, that is only applicable to fish that have a rebuilding management plan in place. These are only commercially valuable species that are both targeted and incidental catch by commercial fisheries. So this category used to be under the IUCN as well until the early 90s, but it was used for low risk species that were not eligible to be categorized under any other classification. But under the PBC Act is very different. I'm just going to show some of the documents for one specific species, but they're all like this. This is the blue whare. And so under the PBC Act, oh, it didn't appear. Oh well. It was assessed by the Threatened Species Committee as critically endangered, but then it was listed as conservation dependent. And the only reason why that happens is because it's important for fisheries, or it gets caught by fisheries. So this has several implications. One of them is about the conservation efforts. So when a species is assessed as threatened under the PBC Act, it gets a recovery strategy that is trying to rebuild the population to conservation levels. But for conservation dependent species, they don't have these recovery strategies. They have rebuilding strategies that are set and managed by fisheries instead of the Department of Environment and the Threatened Species Committee. And so, for example, for the blue ware, this strategy was implemented in 2008. They get reviewed every 5 years. This is from the latest review that was published in 2019, and there was still no sign of a stock recovery. So they don't seem to work very well. The stocks are overfished, and the fish mortality is uncertain. And so these are the lists of the 7 species that are listed as conservation dependent. There were 8 when we wrote the paper, but the southern bluefin tuna was delisted in August 2024, and now is not considered threatened in Australia, even though it's still endangered under the IUCN Red List. In our project, we specifically looked at, well, I just, in case someone can read it, It has a few sharks, so the dogfish, Harrison's dogfish, the gulper shark, and the scallop hammerhead, and the school shark, and some species of fish, including the southern bluefin tuna, blue wahoo, eastern gemfish, and the orange roughy. And so we specifically looked at the species that are listed and are also exported from Australia. And it's 4 of them: the southern bluefin tuna, orange roughy, blue wahoo, and the school shark. And so southern bluefin tuna was most of the exports, all of them to Japan. It was around 90% of all the exported volume for all the species. And together they made around 10% of all the seafood exported from Australia. The vertical lines is where each of them got listed under the CBCS Act. And so from all this, we had 3 main recommendations. The first one is that all threatened species should be protected equally, regardless of their commercial value. They should be assessed by an independent environmental commission rather than fisheries. And then we also have the annual review of conservation status. So right now they get regular assessments, but it's focused on the stocks. So for example, the rebuilding strategy talks in terms of like economically sustainable yield rather than like conservation metrics. And we think that the reviews should be done according to the metrics that like each category has within the threatened species. And then the protection of global threatened species as well. So one of the critiques that the Act has gotten is that it's not complete, that it doesn't include all the endangered species, some of them are not assessed. And so we looked at species that are considered threatened globally, but are still like commercially caught and exported from Australia. And we found that there are 13 species that are listed under the IUCN Red List and exported from Australia, 11 of which have declining populations. And the PBC Act does not protect them. Some of them have been nominated to be included in the threatened species list in Australia, but they were rejected because of data deficiency. And so we argue that if you know that globally a species is threatened, even if you don't have enough data, maybe you should have some protections in place until you have the knowledge. And another thing that I haven't talked about here, but I'll just introduce is like other conventions of like conservation for threatened species. For example, the Convention of Migratory Species or the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES. These 2 Australia has signed to, so it's made a commitment to respect the regulations, but they include something that's called a reservation. And so when a species is listed under them, a country can present a paper and basically say, I don't accept this listing, and the regulations don't apply for that species in that country. And Australia has the highest number of reservations under CMS in the world, all of them for sharks. And so we think that the PBC Act should have a regulation around that. If Australia has committed to these conventions, then the environmental protection legislation should have some regulation around like how many reservations can Australia have, if any. And that's me.
Hi everyone, so my name's Hannah and I'm going to be talking about some research that came out of my first PhD chapter that was published last year. Pro-compliance and exemptions facilitate ongoing deforestation, if anyone wants to have a read after this chat. So also a big thank you to my supervisors and co-authors of this research as well. So the brief context that kind of set me off wanting to investigate this is that Australia is a wealthy country and we have a lot of environmental policies already in place and these have been in place for decades, and we have enough money to enforce them and implement them. So although we have a lot of talk that we need stronger laws and better laws, and yes, that is the case, we really should have the policies already in place to protect the environment. So if that's the case, why do we still have such high deforestation rates? So that then led me to ask the following question. To what extent is deforestation regulated by Commonwealth and state territory laws in Northern Australia? So the reason I'm focusing on Northern Australia here is because Queensland is our kind of current deforestation hotspot in Australia, but clearing rates are really predicted to increase in the Northern Territory. Whereas in more southern states in Australia, we've already seen a lot of clearing and there's less vegetation left available to clear. So just quickly running through the methods. Firstly, we developed a framework to understand the policy-related pathways that are leading to deforestation. Then we identified recent deforestation events across Northern Australia. The reason we focus on large clearing events that are bigger than 20 hectares is because a lot of the policies in place that we looked at have exemptions for really small amounts of clearing. So clearing events that are like 1, 2, or even 5 hectares, it's difficult to know if that's exempt or potentially non-compliant, hence the pretty big threshold. And finally, we classified these deforestation events according to our framework. So I'm going to go through what the framework looks like now. So this is the first row where we consider all of our relevant legislation. So what this means is that every clearing event can have multiple policies that apply to it. So what I then decided was for that clearing event, was it fully compliant, which means it's compliant with all policies, partially compliant, which means it was compliant with at least one, but not all of them. Potentially non-compliant, which is that I couldn't find any publicly available evidence of compliance, or no legislation relevant, which means I couldn't find any relevant policies that would regulate that clearing event. Then you can also consider each piece of legislation individually, which is very similar, but this time I can look into the detail of the approval and check whether it was actually an assessment process or an exemption. So the reason we've kind of set the framework out like that is because whichever pathway the clearing events are falling into suggests to us what we need to do to try and reduce deforestation in the future. So for example, if most clearing is falling into the compliant pathway through an assessment process, we potentially need to tighten the assessment process. If it's mostly exempt, we probably need to reduce the exemptions and so on and so forth. So this then is my study area. So this is where I was mapping clearing events across Northern Australia. I'm only going to talk about results from the Northern Territory and Queensland because we had a lot of problems with the data in Western Australia, which I don't have time to go into now, but you can always ask me at the end if you're interested. So you don't need to read this table. I'm just pulling it out as an example to show how I decided if a clearing event was regulated. So I had 9 different policies, but we're only going to focus on the EPBC Act for this example. So any clearing event that significantly impacts a matter of national environmental significance ought to be assessed and approved under the EPBC Act. So I needed to create a data set to represent that. So my data set for that is threatened or migratory species habitat mapping of forest and woodland species, associated species that were listed as threatened at the time of clearing. And again, I had a 20 hectare threshold. So if there was 10 hectares of threatened species habitat loss, I said, that's fine, it doesn't matter, it doesn't need a referral. Anything over 20 hectares does. So just to be really clear, because that's a little bit confusing, I'm going to go through one example with one clearing event, and then we'll talk about my results. So this is one of my clearing events. It was in central Queensland. We'll just say it's about 60 hectares. It's that one kind of here. So I had a look at the mapping, and you can see that there's about 30 hectares of mapped greater glider habitat occurring in that clearing event. And a greater glider is an EPBC listed threatened forest associated species. So I would expect that to have a referral to the EPBC Act. It's also 30 hectares of remnant vegetation classified as category B, which doesn't really matter, but it's just to show that that means it also needs Queensland state vegetation management approval as well. So then I would expect this clearing event to have evidence of a referral to the EPBC Act and what's called a notification to clear under the PMA. And if it has both of those things, I would call that fully compliant. If it only has one, I'd call it partially compliant. And if it doesn't have either, I'd call it potentially non-compliant. And we know that it's not going to fall into that last pathway of the framework where there's no policies, because we know that it has two relevant policies. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the results for this. So I did this for this clearing event, and then I did it 18,000 more times across all of Queensland and Northern Territory, and these are my results. So we've got Queensland at the top and then Northern Territory in the middle, and I guess I'm just going to pull out a few key results. So the first one to note, which is the good news, is that all deforestation events should have been covered by at least one and up to 3 laws. There are no clearing events occurring in the furthest right-hand pathway where there's no legislation relevant. The maybe not so good news is that most clearing was only partially compliant with our national and subnational laws. So Queensland, as an example, we've got about a third falling into that green fully compliant pathway, and around about a half in the partial compliance, and then we've also got some falling into that red potential non-compliance pathway as well. So although that's interesting, I think it's a lot more interesting when we dig into the individual pieces of legislation, and then we can talk more about the EPBC Act as well. So this is when we look into each individual piece of legislation. I've got all my policies on the bottom of this graph. So the EPBC Act is here, EPBC Act is here, Queensland on the left and Northern Territory on the right. And I've broken it into a proportion so that we can compare between Queensland and the NT, because Queensland had much higher clearing rates than the Northern Territory. So the first result to note is that most of our potential non-compliance that we were seeing in the previous slide is or appears to be associated with the EPBC Act, which is our Commonwealth law. So in the Northern Territory, we didn't have any evidence of a clearing event with a referral to the EPBC Act. And in Queensland, it was about 65%. In Queensland, you can see we have clearing falling into most of our pathways. So we have a little bit of exempt clearing. So the exemption that we were able to map was called the continued use for agriculture exemption. And what this means is that any regrowth clearing that's on a continual, uninterrupted cycle can be cleared on that cycle without a referral to the EPBC Act. So we decided to kind of interpret that as anything that had been regularly cleared within 15 years was exempt. So that's the exempt portion that you can see. We've got some compliance, and then we've got some not relevant. So that portion is the clearing events that involve some threatened species habitat clearing, but not over the 20 hectare threshold. So that's kind of a breakdown of the EPBC Act. The other interesting result that I'll pull out is that in Queensland, about 3/4 of clearing was exempt from our main state law, which is called the Vegetation Management Act. And that was because of quite a few different exemptions, but mainly because it involved the clearing of regrowth. So that's forests and woodlands that have been cleared, mainly for agriculture. They've regrown and then they're allowed to be cleared again. So although that might not seem directly relevant to the EPBC Act, it kind of is, because a lot of the clearing that's exempt under state laws is the portion that is potentially non-compliant under law. So what that means is that we're seeing a disconnect between state and federal laws, and a lot of potential confusion for people trying to manage their land, where they think it's exempt and perhaps don't realize that it's actually potentially non-compliant. And you can, I guess there's some evidence for that from this report that was published in 2018 as well, So this is a really good review of interactions between the EPBC Act and the agricultural sector, and it involved a big survey of farmers all across Australia, and it showed that 1/4 of them had never heard of the EPBC Act, and 80% did not understand their legal obligations under the Act, which then starts to make sense why we're seeing a lot of potential non-compliance. It's actually a really confusing space for landholders managing their land. I could keep talking about this, but I'm going to finish up with some recommendations. It's Faye's turn to speak. So for the EPBC Act, we suggested we need much better education for landholders on their legal obligations, when there might be threatened species, when they need to refer, what sort of things constitute a significant impact. And then of course we also need better enforcement with this too, which is kind of to do with the new nature positive reforms and the EPA that they will talk more about. In Queensland, for our Vegetation Management Act, we're suggesting we need much better and more targeted incentivisation for regrowth retention on private lands. This could be things like biodiversity stewardship schemes, where we pay people to encourage them to retain vegetation. This is potentially a much better option than making stricter laws and trying to just stop people from clearing altogether. And finally, I kind of touched that I had a lot of problems with data in Western Australia, some problems with data in WA. Queensland has by far the best data. So like taking a kind of national perspective, we really need much better land clearing data, which shows clearing, it shows new regrowth, it's publicly available, it's regularly available because there's such a delay at the moment with good land clearing data. And we need really transparent definitions as to what constitutes deforestation, because at the moment our national data and our Queensland data have kind of different definitions for how they treat forests. It can make it really confusing for mapping this sort of data. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Faye. I'm also a PhD student. My PhD looking into how policy can be better formulated for climate change. But the part that I'm going to present here is not part of my PhD. It's kind of a weekend project. A couple of us just flew together and trying to make some comments about the EPBC reform. And since you heard about all the EPBC shortcomings of the EPBC Act, I thought I'll move on to talk about the reform and the suggestions that we put in that can make positive policy changes. And all the talk that follow up from this is based on the EPBC reform. And since based on that, I thought we'll take a step back and look into the timeline of this EPBC Act review through time. So EPBC Act is, I'll quickly go through this very briefly because many of us are quite familiar with this, just to set the background of that. But EPBC Act was first enacted in 1999. In the Act itself, there is a clause that mandates the first review must be done within the first 10 years, and then the subsequent review not more than 10 years. Therefore, accordingly, the first review is done by Alan Hawke and submitted to the government in 2009, which is 10 years later, and shortly 2 months later, there is a government response to that review. But most of us are not very familiar with this review because it's quite a long time ago. And what we are more familiar with is the second EPBC independent review led by Professor Graham Samuel, also titled, also we are familiar with what's called the Samuel Review, is submitted and to the minister in year 2020 October, but it only made public in about 3 months later. There is no any sort of response after this release of the independent review. What happened next is the last Australian federal election in year 2020 in May, which is more than a year later. But there's still no response whatsoever by the then government. The newly elected government, Labour government, that has released these nature positive plans as the response to the second independent review, titled Nature Positive Plan. And In that, they target the reform of this nature conservation law, which then split into different stages. So far, only stage 1 has been released and passed, and is related to the nature repair market, which is called the Nature Repair Bill. The subsequent stages, stage 2 and potentially stage 3, is appear to be stalled, and that includes one of the election promise, which is to set up EPA in that's made in 2022. So this is a very short and brief timeline. It's not to scale, and it's not to the temporal scale and significance of the event, but it just gives a brief outline of what happened. And while the next part of discussion, we're just going to be focused on this government response to called nature positive plan. So nature positive term is first coined by Harvey Locke and colleagues in year 2020, published in 2021, and it basically has 3 very obvious, very specific timeline: 0 net loss of nature from 2020, net positive by 2030, and full recovery by 2050. The definition that adopted by the nature positive plan of different versions quite closely resemble this original definition, but there is lack of very specific quantifiable requirements, which is the baseline year as well as the target year. So gain, but gain based on what? Loss based on what? And we think that that is crucial. Therefore, we argue that nature positive, to achieve true nature positive, it requires absolute net gain. And this is the 4 key steps that we argue that should be taken to achieve a true nature positive outcome. So first of all, I'll go through each of this briefly, but first is to legislate absolute net gain. What this means is net gain based on a fixed baseline instead of a relative baseline, which is, for example, business as usual baseline. The nature positive plan or the government response to the EPBC reform, the EPBC review and the potential reform allows developers to carry out impacts and only compensate based on relative net loss. So what that means, sorry, not relative net loss, relative net gain, my bad, relative net gain. And what that actually means is what happens if there is no intervention as a business as usual background scenario. It's just you do a little bit better and that's enough. In a background baseline, declining baseline, that could still mean an overall loss. An example would be like when you are driving on a 80 km/h zone, you're driving at 120 km/h. Relative gain or relative improvement is you reduce your speed down to 100 km/h. But you're still speeding, right? And you still get a ticket but it's not good enough. What should be done is to do a significant improvement as in relative to a baseline and drop your speed down to 80 or even below, depends on the circumstances of the road, whether if there's wildlife around, how narrow and things like that, and hopefully below 80 and not 75, even lower. So this is not the case. A nature positive policy should not be a policy that only aim to slow down the decline. It should aim for absolute positive gain. Next, all impacts on biodiversity due to development should be fully compensated. And for those impact on irreversible biodiversity should not be impacted in the very first place. This is quite straightforward. I'm not going to elaborate more on that, but I'm just going to put more attention to the last one. The nature positive plans propose to set up a conservation fund payment scheme, which allows developers to pay sum into a government managed fund if they cannot find an offset sites on the impact that they introduce. If the developers cannot find an offset sites, they can choose to pay into this conservation fund. This is a leads to a significant risk because, first of all, if you can't find an offset sites, that likely means that it's a critically endangered or vulnerable or endangered species. It's almost impossible to find sites. If not, those to conserve those species is going to be extremely expensive. So if impact is still allowed to go through and site being destroyed, that's likely lead to the species decline. Even if you can find a site to conserve for that species, it's likely that this fund payment is not enough to cover the conservation costs to lead to a positive conservation actions, to lead to an additional gain to cover the impact. And lastly, even with the payment, we know that most of the payment, this is not something new. Many states and local government has these offset funds set up. And we can see that many of these funds accumulated way faster than it's being spent. For example, in Queensland, only 2% of the fund has been spent. And in Southern Australia, only 1/3 of 50 million has been spent in the last 15 years. So this conservation fund that is collected but not spent likely means the loss of biodiversity because you collect the money, allow the impact, but this money is kept and not being spent. So this is likely represent the biodiversity loss, right? And next, nature positive policy should not just aim to mitigate impacts. It should go beyond mitigating impact. It should actively recover what was lost by restoration. And this definitely requires significant funding for effective conservation actions. The stage 1 reform that I showed just now introduced the nature repair market, which aim to draw more private funding, but their significance or their impacts is still uncertain. And therefore, government funding is still the main source of funding for conservation actions, but it's historically inadequate. And however, having said that, the most recent federal budget that was released last week allocated 250 million for the next 5 years to conserve 30 million hectares of forest, 30 million hectares of land to achieve the 30 by 30 target. It's a significant increase compared to the federal budget last year. But then the question is, where is this 30 million going to be placed? Is it conserving? Is it conserve additional land? What's the impact of this conservation fund? Even if we just look at the purely monetary value, it still falls short of the recommended required sum. The recommended funding range between 5 billion based on a report led by Visit Simon in 2023 suggests that this 5 billion is required to effectively achieve 30 by 30 target, to a whopping 583 billion per year for the next 7 years based on a recent article led by April. So this 583 billion is to effectively restore, to remember this correctly, is to effectively restore habitat that's for endangered species. And the map on the right is taken from the recent article by that led by April, and the darker color means the area that require higher cost as well as more higher risk, as well as more species needed to be conserved. Lastly, as suggested by Hannah and Rosa just now about the enforcement part. Enforcement is key to ensure compliance. And effective enforcement agency like the EPA, Environmental Protection Authority, could be an answer, but this authority should be an independent agency, free and independent to make decisions with limited ministerial discretion. This is key because in the nature reform, in in the EPBC reform proposal, they have a clause to allow ministerial calling power to change certain decision, which slightly lead to a weaker enforcement or a weaker enforcement outcome. Monitoring is important to track the trajectory of how biodiversity perform based on the baseline and how are we on track to achieve nature positive. But such monitoring should not only track the biodiversity outcome, instead, for example, how much forest loss or gain, but it should also monitor the attributions that lead to this gain or loss. For example, so we can derive what's the driver that lead to all this loss and gain, and therefore adaptive management or policy changes can address these drivers and reverse this losing trend. That's pretty much it as a conclusion. So again, nature positive policy shouldn't be a policy that encourage declining less. However, we do acknowledge that however robust, no matter how robust the legislation is, it can be reversed with due procedure. Legislation can go through cycles of strengthening and weakening. As you can see in the most recent salmon fiasco, I don't think I need to elaborate more on that, but things can go backwards and in a really bad way. So therefore, we think that mechanism for creating a robust system for environmental protection is crucial. Methods, for example, concern scientists that make noise, that make suggestions, and community engagements that ensure that community knows what we're talking about, as well as more top-down approach, international conservation laws, policies, or agreements that may encourage change, that may prevent certain changes from going too bad. Right, that's pretty much it. Thanks very much.
Question for Hannah and maybe Faye as well. So just wondering, because EPBC Act seem to be the one that people don't really abide to in the land clearing things. So what are the consequences of not following it? And do you know if any of those companies face these consequences? And a follow-up question to that is, what do you think are the major contributing factors of people not really following it? Is it because of maybe the EPBC Act maybe has set too high standards where people just don't think it's doable, and then knowing that there's no enforcement, so maybe enforcement is another issue, or is it really just people don't really know about the
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I guess your first one about enforcement. So yes, there was quite a lot of enforcement early in the days of the CBCS Act. In fact, there were some really large fines for even really small amounts of clearings. I think the smallest one was less than a hectare, like a Ramsar wetland or something, and it was really high fines for that. But that was early in the 2000s, and it seems like there's been a bit of a trend for kind of less and less that was on. I guess with the difficulty of the potential non-compliance, it's a bit of a complex story, but I think one of the contributing factors is the significant impact guidelines. So you don't need a referral if you're going to impact a threatened species. You need a referral if you're going to significantly impact a threatened species. And the significant impact guidelines are you do them yourself. So for like a mining company, they have enough money to bring in ecological consultants, and they can do really in-depth surveys and try to make a pretty informed decision as to whether that would clearing from mine would significantly impact that threatened species. If you're, say, like a farmer in the agricultural industry, you likely don't have the money and the time to bring in a team of ecological consultants to decide if there's going to be a significant impact from your land clearing, especially agriculture in Australia. There's long droughts, like if it rains, you really need to take advantage of like good times. You can delay for kind of 3 or 6 months while you do that assessment. So I guess that it's complex, but I think there's just a lot of contributing factors that make it not very well designed for the agricultural system.
Yeah, I think I only got 2 things to add to that. First of all is what Hannah has presented just now. If certain clearing is above certain threshold, then only you need to do all this reporting, right? And if clearing less than that, if everyone clearing half a hectare, you don't get any record of those, but clearing is still happening. So therefore, there's a paper by I think Michelle was on there. That's super relevant. And other than that, it's also then the monitoring part, whether if all these impacts is self-assessed, and if the self-assessed part is not being closely policed and the enforcement is not done properly, you will never know if the force is clear.
Yeah, following on from Sam's question as well on enforcing regulations. I think in my studies of work at the moment, I've come across a lot of landowners and farmers and graziers that are very, kind of push back on environmental stuff or government intervention in any sort of way. So how do we make more effective or increase enforcement on regulation without pushing people like that further away from us, like our values, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess we're kind of thinking a lot about that in the Queensland space at the moment. So like I touched on, like the regrowth is exempt from state vegetation management laws. And so what we're kind of trying to think about at the moment and what was recommended from a recent kind of expert panel was that we don't change legislation anymore. It's just too much uncertainty. What we want to do instead is things like payments for ecosystem services, stewardship schemes, and really getting people to realise the benefit of having biodiversity and regrowth on their land. Now, obviously, there's a lot of like things to think about with that. We still want to try and make it as additional as possible. So we don't really want to pay people to retain vegetation if it wasn't at risk of loss. But that is my final PhD chapter, so I can always tell you the results of that when I finish the model. And Brodie's looking at that kind of stuff too. So like trying to actually go out and talk to farmers about increasing the productivity of their land by putting vegetation on there as well. Yeah.
I'm still sort of wrapping my own head around this, but I find it so interesting about how you're talking about sort of the self-reporting, because one thing that comes to my mind is you have to have a certain amount of knowledge also to be able to wrap your head around that. And I wonder if any of you, also in the aquatic sphere, I assume that this is going to apply, if you could speak a little bit to maybe where the role of education might come into this, in terms of some of the people outside of our science sphere being able to wrap their heads around what's actually going on in the first place, so that they don't, I can imagine a lot of people who aren't necessarily complying, they might literally just be completely out of it, in the sense of not knowing that there was anything relevant on their land in the first place. How do we sort of start to address that kind of gap?
Do you want to go first?
So I could say there are 2 different perspectives to look at it from like the seafood perspective. One of them is like consumers and retailers. Like whenever I presented this, a lot of people, they don't know that you can be eating a threatened species in Australia. And they're just like, oh, I can't believe it, but it's perfectly legal. And so one piece of education that maybe wouldn't be like completely I don't know, like the first answer would be to also think about the consumers, and if they knew, maybe they wouldn't consume this and they wouldn't be so valuable, or like, they wouldn't be able to sell them as much. And the other one for fisheries, Leslie might be able to talk about from like fishers perspective. I have presented this and had people from fisheries management come up, and like they a lot of them like defend the fisheries management. So they say like, if it's managed by fisheries, then it's probably exploited to like the right amount. I don't know if fishers themselves like.
Yeah, I would say a big problem in like collaborators we work with in the law school organs as well. And Australia's laws are just so much more confusing than they need to be. I think probably that extends like beyond environmental legislation. So there's a lot of laws in the fisheries space that we don't even know how they got there or why. An example that the Moreton Bay fishers are really annoyed about is that they're not allowed to anchor their gill nets. So gill net is this just net that kind of sits in the water and stuff swims into it and gets entangled. So they can't anchor it at both ends, so it's like flapping around. And they hate this law because it makes it easier for like it to get tangled. So the turtles and things that they don't want to catch, or recreational fishing boats or whatever. But there's this law that no one really knows like why you can't anchor this gill net. So now fishers are trying to get around. They always find a way kind of around it. So this one guy just took some brick, because it's not an anchor, and like tied it to the end of his net. So there's so many things like throughout all the legislation that just need to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
Because I can't really fault the fishers for like not having their head around the Commonwealth law and their own state law and all this stuff, because it actually is too big of an ask, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think those also, I was gonna say that like for fisheries specifically, there's just a lot of different laws. They have like Commonwealth fisheries, state fisheries, regional fisheries, EPBC Act, like, and they're all like different laws.
And you can see this when you try and get a permit to do some like very low impact research anywhere, you're like, there's all these different, or ethic, there's so much different stuff. And there's just endless permits and forms and different levels of things, so.
And that does feel like it goes very strongly to my question, because this sort of transitions back to Hannah and Faye and the terrestrial sphere. I come very much from the bird side of things. And so just the last few weeks, I was actually birding around a lot of agricultural fields here in Queensland, and I would, be on the side of the road and farmers would come up and talk to me. And of course, they don't necessarily know what birds are living on their land, because realistically, that's not their job. And so if there is a threatened species in some remnant forest on their property, they very likely have no clue it's there. It's a different aspect of it, but it's that same problem of this being a very big ask of just having this much knowledge to be able to kind of wrap your head around all of it. And so I guess maybe in the terrestrial sphere, how do you see that side of things playing out, that sort of maybe education gap?
Oh, 100%. It's like such a big problem with the EPBC Act. I mean, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the significant impact guidelines. I should have put them up here, but they are so confusing, and it's different depending on whether the species is vulnerable or endangered. That makes it a completely different set of criteria. So I don't think we can begin to ask a farmer to make a sell this, but I don't know what the solution to that is.
Fair.
Yeah, so one of the first CBCS independent review has already suggested that the act need to be simplified. That's not the right term, sorry. I'm not a law student, I don't know the right, but simplify so that people can understand and can be implemented more effectively. And but 25 years later, still, yes. And also one of my another PhD students in the same lab, Shu did some farmers talked about some private landowners about private land conservations. But the gist that she got is people stay away from that because the procedure is just too complicated, and they just even they have even if they have the willingness to want to conserve, it's just the admin, the people is just strong and it's just like, no, I just want to conserve and I don't even want the money for that, but I just don't know where to start. So that's the part that probably need to be streamlined. Some public education really important.
Online, there's congratulations from Select, so excellent talk, and April, really appreciated Popping in particular. And Matt Holden has a question. Thanks, Faye, Hannah and Rosa, really great talks. Question for Faye. Do you think there are promising approaches for accounting for uncertainty in the outcome of actions towards achieving a nature positive future? You mentioned not allowing too risky actions, but how to balance risks versus benefits when the future is so uncertain?
Right. It's a really difficult part to answer about the balance, the uncertainty and the risk. But if we know, for a more straightforward answer would be if we have seen all the conservation payment or offset payment scheme in Australia, and most of the states and local government that has the scheme has not been implemented well. It potentially suggests that it's a policy or method that potentially doesn't work and may not necessarily work well if we roll. So the risk therefore can derive that is potentially really high and probably should not allow that kind of system in the new, if we have a reform and a new nature conservation law. That other type of risk, I think it's really not easy to assess the risk and uncertainty part. So I can't really answer that part well.
That whole discussion point. I mean, all over the world, the hot topic right now, it's like, so people are moving away from rural areas to cities, but there's a lot of like natural regeneration happening everywhere. So, what it is some kind of nature positiveness and is it happening? You know, it's happening.
Yeah, so we have a lot of forest regeneration going on in Queensland. And in fact, most of the clearing, although it seems like there's really high clearing rates in Queensland, about 75% of it is actually this like regenerated forest of the land. So we have a huge potential for that to be used for restoration purposes and carbon sequestration, carbon farming and the like. It's just a bit of a challenge in Australia. We've had a lot of low integrity problems with our carbon markets, and so we need to try and make sure that we, if we are going to kind of pay people to retain that, it's as high integrity as possible. And I don't think it's so relevant as in other countries where people are kind of moving into the city in Queensland, because I guess, yeah, that area has been used for agriculture for a long time, and it will continue to do so at the moment because it's profitable.
Yeah, I think the question on whether that type of movement will be nature positive or not, it highly depends on whether after people has left those land, will that be left to regenerate by itself? It can be, if it can be regenerated or restored to the certain vegetation state, or will it be just maintained as an agricultural land for foreseeable future? And if the land is still going to be maintained and the biodiversity value in those land is still going to stay, I think therefore there's no gain through that movement, but that probably goes into the discussion of the land sharing, and it's very hard. But yeah, that's what I think.
Do you see the difference between the clearance between the company driven or the community driven? For example, such as for the community, it might be influenced by the traditional value of the clearing the land, and also the scale will be different between the company and also the community. So my questions in terms of the regulation compliance, is that driven mainly, for example, for the companies mainly due to the enforcement, while the community, is there any traditional value that reflect or involve as?
So I think if I understand your question, it's like the clearing, is it distributed between companies which are like traditional owners and not? Yeah, so not really. So I guess I'm not an expert on First Nations groups in Australia by any means, but not a lot of the clearing is happening because of their activities. And in fact, most of the areas that they manage are things like national parks and they're really quite well protected. Whereas a lot of the clearing in Australia is more kind of mining industry, renewable energy is a new big one, agricultural sector, infrastructure, roads and like.
Anyway, it was just to add to Jonathan's question there about the education and that sort of thing, and I guess something that sort of from that end, Jonathan, I wanted to add on that was like 20 years ago, we used to have a really well-funded extension service in Queensland where farmers had a government officer who they could engage with and discuss farm management strategies and all that sort of thing to understand how they can better manage those outcomes. And that has been massively defunded and drawn back to the point now, the natural resource management regions in Queensland, some of them are covering areas like the size of the UK, Belgium and Netherlands combined, and they have 2 biodiversity extension officers or less that are trying to cover all those properties. So now what's happened is that a farmer, their only engagement with government is they get, if they do some illegal clearing, they get a letter in the mail saying, we've just picked you up. And they talk about, oh, the tree police have got us from slats in the city, and they get super upset about it because they've done the wrong thing, but there hasn't been the dialogue there. And so it's a huge problem that really needs addressing to have that extension and that on-ground engagement, because otherwise, yeah, it's really fighting an uphill battle.
And that probably gets to your question earlier about like having trusted people that they can talk to rather than just, getting a letter saying that they're